Well, don't let me go too long. If I talk past 30 minutes, you might want to start waving me down. I've given this talk now twice. I've talked in Columbia and in Kansas City about this topic, and there I feel like I have to give a bit more of the backstory. But here I feel like St. Louis, we have seen what's been going on with the interdistrict choice. We've seen it in the news, we've seen it on the television, and so many of you, I think, have a pretty good grasp as to what's been happening in the St. Louis area in terms of unaccredited schools. But to just give a little bit of a backstory, you know that we have a law that allows students in unaccredited or failing school districts to transfer to a nearby accredited school district. Now that law was passed back 20 years ago, back in 1993, but it never really went into effect because there weren't unaccredited schools at the time, and then once the St. Louis schools became unaccredited and parents tried to use it, it got tied up in the courts for a number of years. And so finally, in 2013, the Missouri Supreme Court ruled again, after ruling previous occasions, that yes, the law is clear, the law is constitutional, and students have that right to transfer to a nearby accredited school district. So even though we had essentially 20 years to prepare for this inevitability, well, I don't know if you call it inevitability, but we had 20 years to prepare for this, there were really no preparations in place. It caught the school districts almost off guard. Go ahead, John. So I've had the opportunity to interview many of the superintendents in the St. Louis area and ask them questions about the transfer program and many of the other people involved in this issue, and basically ask what happened, and that's what I'm talking about today. But when I was talking to Jeff Marion, the superintendent of St. Charles School District, he said the law had been on the books, but I think people really thought it would never be implemented. I don't know that there was any real preparation for it. As long as it was tied up in the courts, people were just kind of on hold. So we had 20 years to prepare for this law, 20 years to prepare for how we might handle it, but there were no preparations in place. The ruling comes down in June, students go back to school in August, and they were scrambling to come up with a way to place students from these two unaccredited school districts into wherever they wanted to go. It caught people kind of by surprise, even though maybe it shouldn't have. Go ahead. Immediately when the ruling came down, this is what we heard. In the newspapers, in the op-eds, in the letters to the editor, in the town hall meetings, we heard that there's crisis ahead. When you allow these students to transfer from the unaccredited school districts into the accredited school districts, it's going to lead to overcrowding. It's going to dumb down the education. It's going to lead to conflicts between people. So the editorial board of the St. Louis American said, and this is, you know that this is our predominantly African-American newspaper, they said we're mostly apprehensive, fearing hostile learning environments, clashes between youth who have had no training in understanding one another, and the potential abject failure of two struggling black school districts that could start a domino effect. If you remember this quote from Ghostbusters, human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria. I mean, this is what people predicted in the receiving districts and in the unaccredited school districts. That it would lead to bankruptcy, that you would drain the best students away, leaving the worst students behind, that the achievement in the unaccredited school districts would go down. Very few people predicted positive outcomes from this transfer program. It was almost all negative. So what I wanted to do, more than a year after the program had started, is say, what happened? Let's take a look at some facts, let's assess what really happened, and try to assess whether or not those predictions came true, if there are any positives that came out of this. That's essentially what I'm doing today, is trying to present some of the facts and then some of my interpretation about what I think. So the first question I think that's important to know is who transferred? Because again, we were told that the best and brightest students might leave. By August 1st, okay, remember the ruling comes down in June, August 1st, we had 2,600 students placed by Ed+. Now Ed+ used to be the cooperating school districts of Greater St. Louis. And they really stepped up, and even though there weren't preparations in place, they got on board and I thought did a pretty good job of placing students by August 1st. Now these two districts, again, only have about 10,000 students. Relative to St. Louis, they're relatively small, but a quarter of the students applied to transfer to other school districts. That's a pretty significant amount, to lose a quarter of your students at once. So by August 1st, 2,600 students placed. And we could see this is the grade level, kindergarten through 12th grade, and the number of students. And here we have 150 and 200 students. So at every grade level, we had close to 150 students apply to transfer. The most being in 9th grade, which makes intuitive sense. Students switch schools at 9th grade. And we've seen the news stories here in St. Louis. Normandy High School had been declared just previous to this the most dangerous high school in the area, maybe in the state. So it makes sense that students going into high school might want to transfer. And then we see a decline, which again makes sense. You'd see fewer students in their 12th grade transferring. But this also reflects the enrollment in the district. So if you look at the enrollment in these schools, the enrollment in 9th grade is a lot higher than the enrollment in 12th grade, because both of these districts have a pretty high dropout rate. So just the number of students in 12th grade is much lower than the number of students in 9th grade. But we can see there's demand across all grade levels for students wanting to transfer. Now, how did they perform? These charts show the relative performance of the transfer students. So here we have the year prior to transferring, the students in the unaccredited school district, the transfer students, and then the state. Okay? At the top, you have the students on the English Language Arts exam scoring advanced, proficient, basic, below basic. We want students in the purple and green. We typically talk about school districts scoring proficient or advanced. And you could see in the unaccredited school district, it's less than 20% of the students are scoring proficient or advanced. The transfer students are slightly higher performing, on average. About 72, 73% were below basic or basic, and so you had slightly higher percent of students that were scoring proficient or advanced. But from this, I think it's clear that they weren't just the best and the brightest. They weren't just the highest performing. There was a pretty good range. You still had more than 70% of the students who were scoring below what the state calls the appropriate level or on grade level. So these are still a wide range of ability students, and many of them performing below grade level. And the same story in math. In math, we see that they're slightly higher performing, but not near as high performing as the state average. So it wasn't just the best and brightest, it was a wide swath of students, but they were slightly, or on average, slightly higher performing than the students who stayed behind. So where did they go? This is another important question. I've arranged here all the school districts from the lowest number of students up to the highest number of students, or all the school districts in the St. Louis area. So we have 20 plus school districts that receive students, ranging from 1 student to 440 students. And this is at the beginning of the school year. There was some attrition through the end of the year, and so at the end of the year there were fewer students. But this is towards the beginning of the school year. And on the left I have the district enrollment, and then what percent increase the transfer students represent. So we could see in most school districts, it represented less than 1% growth, the highest being almost 5% in Brentwood, because Brent was a relatively small district. Even though they received 38 students, it was almost 5%. And even down to Francis Howell, which received the most, it was less than 3%. Francis Howell has over 17,000 students, so getting 440 more represented about a 3% or 2.5% growth in student population. I'm going to put that into perspective just a little bit more. Take a look at Francis Howell in the next slide. This is Francis Howell's enrollment from 2005 to 2014. From 2005 to 2012, they have steady decline in enrollment. A slight uptick the year before transfer students, and then a little bit more. So even after getting transfer students, they're still not back to the level they were in 2009. So this is a large district with lots of school buildings. And when I talked to the superintendent, she told me that they were able to divide the students up. No school received more than 30 students. No class received more than 1 to 3 students. And so the impact was relatively minimal in how many students one school received. It wasn't like even though 440 students is an entire school, that's enough students for a school, They were spread out among grades, spread out among schools, and no school received more than about 30 students. So why did we see this huge variation? And you guys know the answer to this. Why did we see some schools receiving 1 student and others receiving over 400 students? Well, transportation was the key. At the beginning, the law reads as if students can choose any school that they want to go to, and that the district must provide transportation anywhere. Well, that's kind of untenable, and DESE, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, stepped in with some guidelines. Possibly in violation of the law, but nobody's challenged it, so that's what we're going with. So they said, you should choose 1 school to bus students to. Rather than bus students to every single school, which just is not possible, choose 1 district to bus students to. Well, that drove the number of students to certain school districts. Kirkwood, when I talked to Tom Williams, the superintendent over there, said they had about 25 applications before they were announced as a transportation school. And overnight, he said that they jumped to about 175 applications just because they had transportation now being provided to them. Now, if you recall, the districts that were chosen, first it was announced that Melville would be chosen by the Riverview Gardens School District. And if you know your geography, Riverview Gardens is kind of north and Melville's pretty much on the opposite end of the city, south. Immediately there were claims that, oh, they chose this district because it's so far away, they were trying to keep students at home. They were discouraging people from transferring. And then following that, Normandy made their announcement they were choosing Francis Howell. And the same claim was made, that they chose that because it's far away, we want to keep students at home, and so we're going to try to choose a place far away and discourage students from transferring. What the superintendent said, they said, we looked at these things. These are the things we considered when choosing where to transfer students or where to bus students. They said we looked at academics. How well are the school districts doing? What's the tuition cost? Because the tuition ranged and varied in these different school districts. What's the capacity of them to hold new students? Where are they located? And finally, what's the experience with students? You guys know, or should know, that we've had a voluntary transfer program in St. Louis from the St. Louis city schools and the county schools since the 80s. And so they were saying, which schools have taken transfer students successfully in the past? These are the things they said they looked at. I'm convinced that one of these stands out as the most important factor. Tuition, right? Tuition. So this is the per pupil expenditures arranged in those same districts. Per pupil expenditures reflect tuition. The tuition costs were slightly varied from this, but these are per pupil costs. So we have Clayton spending close to around $18,000 per pupil, down to $8,000 in Melville. We're talking about a $10,000 difference in tuition payments because the tuition was based on this. In the voluntary St. Louis program, it's a fixed tuition. In this, it varied depending on each individual school district. So let's take a look at Riverview Gardens. Riverview Gardens is here spending $9,400. You want to get students, if they're going to leave, you want them to go to a place with low tuition, right? You don't want them to go to Clayton because that's going to be expensive. So you want to try to get them to go to one of these school districts where they spend less than you. Well, Rittner was provisionally accredited. Rockwood and Wentzville are even further away than Melville. I think it was a very good calculated decision to choose Melville based on these criteria. It makes sense that they have 4 districts to choose from. Of the 4, it's the best school district to choose. Now Normandy's in a bit different position. Normandy's here spending $12,000, and so they had a lot to choose from. And so for them, it might have come down to capacity or other things, don't know, but they certainly wanted to choose a school district with less tuition. Well, shortly after they announced Melville, if you recall, Melville said, we can't take all these students, which again, might have been in violation of the law, but it wasn't challenged. So Riverview Gardens chooses a second school district, and they chose Kirkwood. Kirkwood being, where is it? Here, 12,000. Now, why did they choose Kirkwood instead of a lower spending district? Well, again, there were only a few districts that spent less than Riverview Gardens, so there weren't really any other choices down here. They had to choose one that spent more. I think Kirkwood was a smart decision. Kirkwood's one of the top districts in the area, very high performing. And if you could funnel more students to Kirkwood that would have gone to Clayton, that's a net positive, right? If the students are going to go here, but you divert them to a place where you save $6,000 in tuition money, it's positive. So they chose Kirkwood, and again, Kirkwood was a place that seemed to be more welcoming and had in the past welcomed many transfer students. Yeah, John?
Who's paying the tuition?
The sending school districts, Normandy and Riverview Gardens, pay the tuition money.
Individuals don't pay any
No,
tuition.
it's the school districts that pay it. So how did the districts respond? I think this is a really important and key question. What did they do because of this program? So we now know about 2,600 wanted to transfer and transferred. They went to about 20 different districts. But what did the districts do differently? Now, for the receiving school districts, it was in many cases business as usual. Now, I don't mean to say that the receiving school districts, the accredited, the Francis Howells, the Clayton, and all the others, that they didn't do anything. What I mean by business as usual is that schools already have systems in place to deal with low-performing students, right? They have methods of screening students and placing them into services, and so they didn't create new systems for these students. They just used the existing avenues for the students. Jeff Marion, again from St. Charles, said it was just like enrolling any other new kids. So basically, they funneled these students into the existing programs, into existing classrooms, and in most cases didn't hire new teachers. Only in the places where they had many students, Francis Howell, they hired reading paraprofessionals or aides. They hired some people to watch students after school ended, but before after school programs started. In most cases, they didn't hire any new teachers. So for the receiving school districts, it was business as usual. But we see that the receiving school districts benefited financially. These are students coming in with tuition money, paying the school districts to take them. Elisa Crouch of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch did a great story about how the money was being spent. And she said, there's little dispute that transfer students have created new financial burdens for the districts, now paid to serve them. What she's meaning is, there's of course some cost for the students coming in. I mean, you have to buy some new supplies, you have to buy some new things for the students. There's some cost for these students. They're not free to educate. But with few exceptions, the new students have been absorbed into existing schools without the need of more teachers and new classrooms. So by and large, in most cases, this is what she found, this is what I found in my interviews with the superintendents, that they were able to take these students and filter them into existing classrooms, and it didn't require them to hire new teachers, bring in new resources, those types of things. Normandy and Riverview Gardens paid more than $20 million in tuition money. So we have these receiving districts, like Francis Howell, where you have declining enrollment for years. The tuition-paying students reverse that trend, bring in additional money. It's a clear financial gain, and all the superintendents I talked to recognize this. It was a clear financial gain for the receiving school districts. Well, how did it impact them academically? This was, especially among conservatives, was one of the most important considerations. They were afraid, bringing in many low-performing students, and as we saw at the beginning, they were, on average, pretty low-performing. Bringing them into higher-performing districts, we're worried that they're going to bring down the education of everyone else. Well, we don't have individual student data that we've looked at yet. Nobody has examined that. But we can look at the school district level at the MSIP scores, MSIP standing for the Missouri School Improvement Program. And what we see is that the MSIP scores weren't really, the MSIP scores weren't really impacted. They did not decline for the receiving school districts. In most cases, they stayed roughly about the same. There's some fluctuation up, some fluctuation down, but the district-wide scores didn't change or decline. How about the sending districts? So on the receiving end, it seems to me that there are very few negatives for the receiving district. They're not negatively impacted financially, they weren't overcrowded or overrun, there was some financial benefit. But the sending districts are a different story. The sending districts, academically, it's hard to say, again, looking at the MSIP scores, what what exactly happened. Riverview Gardens gained 16.8 points on their evaluation. Normandy lost. Now, ideally, I would love to go in and look what these school districts did before and after the program. But they both had new superintendents. So you can't say whether or not the changes were because of the new superintendent or because they were doing something different because of the program. But they both tried new programs, they both tried to do different things and shake things up. One did better, one did worse academically on the state Missouri School Improvement Program. Financially, it's much more clear. Financially, Normandy nearly went bankrupt. Normandy was on the verge of bankruptcy. They finished with $1.5 million in operating funds, but they had started with $9.6 million in reserve. They had asked the legislature for more money. They didn't end up needing that money, but they were really close. The Post-Dispatch reported if they had not cut staff and closed the building in December, that they would have gone bankrupt. Riverview Gardens had more in reserves. They had more than $20 million in reserves, and they forecasted that they could last a few more years. And they have not made, last year they hadn't made significant staffing changes. So financially, the districts were hurt. They were paying not only tuition money, in some cases higher than what they spent themselves, but they were also paying for the transportation costs. So what's the takeaway from this? I mean, we don't have that analysis on student achievement yet to say whether or not the students really benefited or didn't. But looking at how districts responded, looking at sort of the facts of the case, we see that the receiving districts benefited financially. Academically, there's no clear evidence that they were hurt from this program. On the sending side, academically, again, it's not clear. I could see it go in one of two ways in these unaccredited school districts. They lose a quarter of their students, and we heard many people say they're going to be demoralized. They're going to be downtrodden. It's going to make the students who stay behind worse off. I could see them responding that way, feeling bad, feeling down, and not doing well. But I could also see, and I think this is true in some literature you see on crisis in organizations, sometimes organizations rally together, and it makes the organization stronger. I don't know which it is here. I don't know if they've rallied together and have improved, or if it has made them worse. So it's not abundantly clear that there was a positive or a negative from this program. What it really comes down to my thinking, is philosophy. It comes down to your philosophy, how you view schools and how you view spending in education. So I told you that those receiving school districts benefited financially. When I was speaking to one superintendent, he said, yeah, I guess it'd be a good way to pad our bottom line, but to me it felt like blood money. It felt like we were taking resources from a school district that needed it. Never mind that they were also taking students to educate, but we were taking blood money from districts that needed it. And every single superintendent I spoke to said, you know, we just really feel like the money should stay in that district. Those students should get an education in their own community, and that they deserve to have good schools in their own community. Philosophically, they were opposed to the transfer program. And I think that's why we saw at the very beginning such pushback. It reminded me a little bit of at the US level, the sequester. Whenever people started talking about the sequester, immediately people started saying doomsday predictions, how if you cut spending or freeze spending, how awful it's going to be. And it was somewhat like that. It seemed to me there was political posturing at the beginning to say how bad things would be because they wanted to stop the program, because they philosophically didn't believe the students should transfer. They thought they should stay in their own communities. Now, but if you believe that education dollars should be directed by the student to their school that they want to go to, then you could see this as a positive. You see no clear signs, negative or positive, that it's impacted the districts, but by and large, the students who transferred were very supportive. Many wanted to go back. They talk about positive experiences. And so if that's your criteria, students desire to go to the school of their choice, then it seems to be for those students a very positive thing. One more thought on the matter. What really struck me during this research process is how unlike a business schools are. Right? I mean, we talk about that a lot, that schools aren't run like businesses. This is as clear an example of that as you could think of. Okay? First start with the receiving school districts. Francis Howell has declining enrollment from 2005 to 2012. Declining enrollment, typically you think of the students bringing in money, right? So thinking about declining revenues from 2005 to 2012. If you had something that turned the tide for you, brought in additional resources as a business owner, you would think of that as a positive thing. If you saw students as customers that you wanted to serve and earn their business, the receiving school districts would have thought of this as a positive thing. But they didn't view students as customers that they wanted to serve. They viewed them as recipients of education that should go where they were assigned, and that we're responsible for these students, you're responsible for those students. And even on the sending district side, I think we see the same thing, that they don't act like businesses. So the ruling comes down in June, and by the end of the summer, you know you're losing a quarter of your students, and yet they didn't make any changes. They didn't cut any staff, they didn't make any reductions, they didn't right-size the district to serve a quarter of the student, or 3/4 of the student population. So why were they going bankrupt? Well, again, high tuition payments are part of it, but another part of it is not adjusting and right-sizing the district to meet that need. I mean, if you're in a business and you know you're losing a quarter of your revenue, you start making changes ahead of the fact to adjust for that. So they didn't, neither side operated like a business. Neither side treated students like they were customers that they wanted to serve. They treated them more as if they were, again, recipients of education. Now, I think if we, right now, we haven't seen much about the transfer program. In the past few months, there have been very few stories about the transfer program. Why is that? I think it's partly the number is reduced, right? The number of students transferring is reduced. But I think the districts have also started to right-size. And for their sending districts, Normandy and Riverview Gardens, it's not as much of a burden. It's still a burden, not as much this year as it was last year, because it was a sudden shock last year. Just to put it in perspective, you have a quarter of the students leave. In St. Louis public schools, more than a quarter, about close to a third of the public school students are now in charter schools. In Kansas City, it's 40%. So these are both urban districts who have lost a huge portion of their students, but it happened over time. And they're both doing, well, I wouldn't say doing fine, but they're both surviving, right? But here you had a case where a quarter of the students left all at once. And that's partly why that sudden shock made it so rough at first. So I don't want to end without saying there aren't some problems to this program that need to be fixed, because there are some problems. Having this varying tuition rate is not a good idea. To make it sustainable, it would be wise to have a fixed tuition rate like the voluntary program in St. Louis does. Another problem that I think needs to be fixed is the receiving school districts now have really no right to refuse students. Even if they're overcrowded, they have no right. And so I think that there should be some reasonable way for them to determine their space. And I think if you put those fixes in place, this could be a sustainable program for Normandy Riverview Gardens as it has been for the St. Louis voluntary school transfer program. Happy to take questions now.